Nolan Krell boarded the Serenity Wave with dreams of saving his crumbling marriage. But within days he discovered his wife Elira was secretly sleeping with Captain Thorne Veyra. And by the time the sun set on the open sea, one of them would vanish forever. Nolan Krell had never been one for luxury, but this time he spared no expense. After 6 years of marriage filled with silent dinners and forced smiles, he believed a 10-day Caribbean cruise might finally bring life back into their crumbling relationship. The ship, Serenity Wave, was enormous, a floating city of elegance and escape. Elira, his wife, had always spoken fondly of the ocean, her voice turning softer at the thought of open waters and endless skies. Nolan had seen her old notebooks once, filled with drawings of waves and distant islands, and he knew this trip would mean something to her. He hoped it would mean something for both of them. He had no way of knowing what it would become instead. As they boarded the ship, Elira seemed lighter than she had been in years. Her steps were quicker, her laugh came more easily, and her eyes, usually distant, now sparkled with something that Nolan mistook for happiness. The first night passed without incident. They drank champagne on the top deck, clinked glasses under the stars, and danced slowly to the soft music drifting from the lounge. Nolan allowed himself to hope again. He told himself they could go back to how it was in the beginning, before the long silences and the unspoken tension took over. But by the second day, Nolan noticed a shift. Elira would disappear for hours, returning with vague stories about spa appointments or long walks. She avoided eye contact when he asked questions. She barely touched her food at dinner. And her phone never left her hand. When he offered to join her on one of her afternoon outings, she declined casually, then left before he could ask anything else. Nolan tried to trust her. He reminded himself that she was here on a cruise with him, and that was a good sign. Still, the old ache returned. The ache of suspicion that had followed them for years. He buried it under smiles and polite conversation, telling himself that this time was different. By the fourth day, the signs were harder to ignore. Nolan noticed Elira exchanging looks with one of the ship's staff, a tall man with sharp eyes and a crisp uniform. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the man wasn't just any staff member. He was Captain Thorne Veyra, the commanding officer of the Serenity Wave. Tall, confident, and effortlessly charming, the captain was a favorite among the passengers. Women flocked to him for photos and compliments. Elira was no exception, Nolan observed from a distance, pretending not to care. But he saw the way Elira's expression softened around Veyra, how her voice grew breathier, her body more relaxed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Something was forming between them, something secret and dangerous. Nolan's heart sank. He felt a coldness creep into his chest as he sat alone at dinner that night, Elira claiming she had a migraine. Hours later, she returned with wind-blown hair and an unbothered smile. Nolan didn't ask where she had been, he simply nodded and looked away. In his suite, Nolan began to notice the small things, how her perfume lingered in the air longer than usual, how her clothes were rearranged, how her demeanor changed after each disappearing act. He no longer believed her stories. He no longer believed she had come here to save their marriage. While she drifted further away each day, Nolan remained still, calculating, quiet. He stopped trying to convince her to spend time with him and instead started watching, listening, memorizing. The ache in his chest deepened, but so did something else. A dark, sharp pressure building inside, feeding off every lie and every glance exchanged between his wife and the ship's captain. By the end of that fourth night, Nolan no longer cared about reconciliation. The man who had boarded the ship with hope was beginning to fade. In his place, something colder began to take form. Something not yet fully shaped, but quietly growing in the shadows. The dream vacation had cracked, and Nolan could feel the edges splintering. He didn't know what he would do yet, but he knew the truth. Elira wasn't his anymore. And what came next would not be about love, himself as the type of man who would spy on his wife. But something inside him had shifted during the first few days of the cruise. Elira's strange behavior, her secretive smiles, and the silent way she kept her distance began carving out a space in his mind that he couldn't ignore. By the fifth day, his gut no longer whispered doubts. It screamed them. Elira was hiding something, and Nolan needed to know exactly what. The ship, though massive, had its own rhythm. Nolan began learning it quietly. He walked the halls at odd hours, pretending to be lost, studying the patrol routes of the staff and the timing of the cleaning crews. He observed which stairwells were used the least and which corridors had broken security cameras. What began as a need for truth soon became an obsession. Every movement Elira made became a clue. Every absence was a question. And Nolan was determined to find the answers. That morning, Elira told him she had a full day planned. A massage followed by a poolside cocktail class, and maybe a nap afterward. Nolan smiled and wished her well, but once the door clicked shut behind her, he followed. He kept a distance, blending in with other passengers, pretending to admire paintings or check his phone. Elira didn't go to the spa. She didn't go near the pool. Instead, she made her way down a service stairwell that led to the lower decks. Area's passengers weren't allowed. Nolan paused at the top of the stairwell. His pulse thudded in his ears. A cleaning staff member passed by without noticing him. He slipped down the stairs after a moment, taking each step slowly. The air grew warmer the deeper he descended, and the lighting turned dim and industrial. The walls down here weren't adorned with fancy decor. Instead, they were lined with exposed pipes and locked maintenance rooms. This was the underbelly of the ship. He heard faint voices echoing from somewhere beyond the metal hallway. Nolan pressed himself against the wall and moved toward the sound. Around the corner, he saw a narrow corridor leading to a heavy steel door. It had no markings, but the way Elira looked around before opening it confirmed its secrecy. She slipped inside quickly, and the door shut behind her with a dull thud. Nolan stared at it from a distance, unmoving. He didn't need to see more. He already knew who she was meeting. Back in their suite, Nolan sat alone in the dark, replaying what he had seen. The image of that steel door haunted him. She was cheating on him, not just with anyone, but with the captain of the ship. The betrayal stung deeper than he expected. Elira hadn't just wandered emotionally, she had crossed over completely, leaving him behind with full awareness. She had made a choice, and that choice had ignited something in Nolan that couldn't be put out. He started researching the ship's layout using the interactive screens scattered throughout the public areas. He learned about crew passageways, emergency exits, and restricted sections. The door Elira had gone through was known among insiders as the Engine Wing Annex, accessible only to senior officers. Captain Veyra, of course, had unrestricted access. So did his personal guests. Nolan began visiting that part of the ship during different times of the day, observing it from various angles. Sometimes he saw crew members entering and exiting. Other times it was empty and eerily quiet. But every time he saw it, he imagined Elira behind that door, wrapped in someone else's arms. The pain mixed with rage until it no longer felt like emotion. It felt like direction, purpose, a storm forming inside a quiet man. He stopped sleeping. Instead, he watched the sunrise from the upper deck, memorizing escape routes and blind spots. He knew security didn't check the lower floors as often as they claimed. He knew which cameras had faulty angles, and he knew now that Elira wouldn't stop on her own. What Nolan didn't know yet was how far he was willing to go, but each hour brought him closer to the edge. Something had been broken, shattered, and it couldn't be repaired with words, apologies, or another vacation. Nolan wasn't chasing answers anymore. He had them. What he wanted now was silence, the kind only finality could bring. By the 6th day of the cruise, Nolan Krell was no longer the man who had arrived on board with hope in his heart. The version of himself that had wanted to repair his marriage had been left behind somewhere between the crashing waves and the sound of a steel door closing behind Elira. What remained was a man focused only on control, justice, if not the legal kind, then the kind that satisfied the ache in his chest. He moved differently now, with a calmness that came not from peace, but from purpose. While others enjoyed the sun-drenched decks and danced to live music, Nolan watched, calculated, and waited. He studied the ship like it was a puzzle. Each hallway, each deck, each crew member's routine became part of a larger strategy. He discovered that the ship's camera system had blind spots, areas where no surveillance footage was captured, particularly on the far ends of Deck 7 and near the captain's quarters. He learned when the guards took their breaks and which emergency exits weren't properly alarmed. Nolan moved through the vessel, unnoticed, blending in with the casual crowds, smiling when necessary, nodding politely when addressed. Inside, though, he was somewhere else entirely. The final push came late that evening, just as the sun sank below the horizon and cast a golden glow over the ship's edge. Nolan overheard two passengers gossiping in the lounge about the upcoming Captain's Gala Night, an exclusive event hosted by Captain Veyra for VIPs. Nolan already knew Elira had received a private invitation. He had seen the message pop up on her phone while she showered. The captain wanted to meet her for a personal dinner before the gala officially began. It was to be held on a secluded balcony suite attached to the uppermost crew deck, a place guests normally didn't access without clearance. Nolan had already checked the layout of that area earlier that day. He knew there was a narrow service stairwell just a few meters away from the suite's back entrance. It wasn't monitored and connected directly to the deck below, where he could disappear quickly if needed. That night, while Elira carefully applied her makeup and chose her favorite dress, Nolan sat quietly on the opposite end of their suite, pretending not to notice her excitement. She didn't try to hide it anymore. Her betrayal had moved past secrecy into arrogance. As she left with her clutch in hand and a soft hum on her lips, Nolan stood up, walked to the dresser, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, hidden beneath folded clothes, was a heavy steel wrench he had taken from a supply room 2 nights before. It wasn't elegant, but it would do what he needed it to do. He wrapped it in a towel and slipped it into a black messenger bag. The upper decks were quieter than usual, as most of the guests had gathered around the ballroom on the main floor. Nolan passed unnoticed through dimly lit corridors, heart steady, footsteps silent. He reached the stairwell and waited, hidden behind a utility door. He checked his watch. She would be arriving at the suite any minute now. A few minutes later, Elira appeared. She knocked softly, and the door opened just wide enough to let her in. Nolan gave it another 10 seconds, then slipped from the shadows and approached. The hallway was empty. The sound of ocean winds masked his movements. He tried the knob. It was unlocked. Inside, the lights were low and music played softly through the suite's speakers. The room smelled of expensive wine and Elira's perfume. Nolan moved through the space like a shadow, every nerve alive and humming. Ahead of him, down the short hallway, silhouettes of 2 figures appeared, close, intimate, unaware. For a moment, Nolan paused. Time seemed to slow. This was the final crossroad, the place between pain and action. His grip tightened around the wrench inside his bag. There would be no more waiting, no more second chances. He stepped forward, and the sound of his feet brushing the carpet was the only warning they had. The dream vacation was over. What came next would leave an irreversible mark, not just on the ship, but on everyone who had the misfortune of being aboard. The music inside the captain's private suite continued to play, soft and rhythmic, as if mocking the chaos that was about to unfold. Nolan stepped deeper into the room, his breath steady and movements rehearsed in his mind 100 times. Every ounce of pain, betrayal, and confusion had boiled down to this moment. He could see the dim outlines of Elira and Captain Thorne Veyra on the far side of the room, standing close, laughing, completely unaware that the man they had wronged was only a few feet away, holding a weapon in silence. Nolan didn't announce himself. There were no threats, no screaming. The moment didn't call for spectacle. It called for closure. He raised the heavy steel wrench from his bag and crossed the last few steps in a single motion. The first strike landed with brutal force. Captain Veyra collapsed instantly, blood splattering across the cream-colored wall. As he crumpled to the floor with a sickening thud, Elira turned just in time to see the second blow aimed at her lover, eyes wide in horror. She screamed, but Nolan didn't flinch. Her voice, once familiar and intimate, now sounded distant, unreal. She stumbled backward, falling over a chair as she tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The suite was sealed, private, high above the main deck. No one would hear her, and no one was expected to enter for hours. Nolan approached her slowly, his blood-stained hands trembling, not from fear, but from release. Elira tried to speak, tried to beg, but her words didn't reach him. He could only see flashes of what she had done. Her secret meetings, her soft laughter meant for another man, the deliberate lies. This wasn't about rage anymore. It was about ending the story she had rewritten without him. The next moments passed in silence. The wrench slipped from his hand, heavy and soaked. Elira's body lay twisted near the balcony door, her dress torn and stained, her expression frozen in fear. Nolan stood there for several seconds, staring at what he had done. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something that had been broken for a long time. He stepped past her and slid the glass balcony door open. The warm sea air rushed in, carrying the scent of salt and faraway lands. Below, the waves moved peacefully, unaware of the tragedy above. Nolan stared into the dark horizon for a moment, then turned back and dragged Elira's lifeless body to the edge. With a final push, he released her into the night. Her body disappeared into the waves below, swallowed by the ocean's depths. He watched until he couldn't see her anymore. Captain Veyra, though bleeding and unconscious, still clung to life on the sweet floor. Nolan considered in finishing the job, but something inside him resisted. Killing Elira had felt final, like closure. Killing Veyra now would just be noise. He returned to the sink, washed his hands and face, and wiped the blood off his clothes as best he could. He changed into the backup outfit he had hidden earlier, inside a small satchel. When he emerged from the captain's suite, his face was calm and his posture unassuming. No one saw him leave. The hallway was still deserted. Nolan returned to the lower decks, where the crowd from the captain's gala was beginning to gather. He even joined them for a few minutes, sipping champagne, smiling politely at strangers. No one suspected a thing. The night carried on like any other cruise evening. Music filled the ship, glasses clinked, and couples danced under the stars. But above them, in the shadows of the captain's private suite, the truth lay scattered in broken glass and bloodstains. Nolan walked among them like a ghost, quiet, composed, already forgotten in the blur of entertainment and illusion. The ship sailed forward into the dark as if nothing had happened, but the sea had taken its secret, and the Serenity Wave would never be the same again. The morning sun rose over the Caribbean, casting golden light across the calm waves and the glossy white decks of the Serenity Wave. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged. Passengers lounged by the pool with their drinks, crew members carried trays of breakfast, and a soft sound of steel drums echoed through the air. But below the smiles and sunscreen, the ship held a darkness that hadn't yet been discovered. It was a steward named Lyric Dane who first sensed something was wrong. She arrived outside the captain's private suite to deliver the morning itinerary, as she did each day. She knocked, waited, then knocked again. No answer. Uneasy, she entered using her security pass, and was hit instantly by the metallic scent of blood. The room was quiet, except for the whir of the air conditioning and the faint buzz of a fly that had found its way in. Captain Thorne Veyra lay unconscious near the minibar. Dried blood pooled around his head. The suite was a mess. Broken glass, furniture out of place, and splashes of red that told a story far more violent than anyone was prepared to accept. Lyric screamed, alerting 2 nearby guards who quickly arrived and secured the area. Within minutes, ship security took control of the suite, locking it down and requesting medical attention. The captain was still alive, but barely. He was rushed to the ship's infirmary in critical condition, and a full lockdown was initiated on the upper decks. Passengers were instructed to remain calm, told only that there was a medical emergency involving senior staff. Rumors spread quickly, and whispers of violence rippled through the luxury cruise like an infection. Nolan Krell watched from a shaded lounger on Deck 10. He sipped orange juice, his sunglasses hiding the stillness in his eyes. He looked every bit the concerned guest, occasionally glancing toward the restricted areas with appropriate curiosity. He blended in perfectly. No one suspected the quiet, average-looking man sitting alone had anything to do with what was unfolding just a few decks above. But Nolan wasn't celebrating. Inside, his thoughts raced. The plan hadn't gone exactly as he wanted. Elira was gone, swallowed by the ocean, and wouldn't be found, but Captain Veyra had survived. That small detail now threatened to undo everything. If the captain woke up, if he remembered Nolan, if he spoke Elira's name, there would be questions. Investigators would dig, details would surface. Hours passed. By the afternoon, the cruise had changed from a holiday to a quiet investigation. Uniformed officers from the ship's internal security team interviewed guests and crew. Surveillance footage was reviewed and cabin logs were pulled. Nolan remained cautious. He cleaned his fingerprints days earlier, wore gloves during the act, and chose a blind spot for every movement. But nothing was ever perfect, he knew that. The ship's head of security, a sharp former detective named Arliss Mavo, reviewed hours of footage and logs. He noticed a small irregularity, Nolan's presence near the service stairwell the night before, captured briefly on a hall camera just outside the blind spot. It was grainy, but it stood out. Arliss flagged the name, Nolan Krell, husband of Elira Krell, who hadn't been seen since the previous evening. When they checked her cabin, it was empty. Her belongings were untouched. Her phone sat charging beside the bed. It didn't take long for her name to be added to the ship's missing persons list. A quiet knock came to Nolan's door just before sunset. 2 uniformed officers asked him to step outside for questioning. He didn't argue. He calmly followed them, his heart pounding so loudly he could feel it in his throat. He gave measured answers, denied seeing Elira after dinner, and feigned concern about her disappearance. But he knew the walls were closing in. Captain Veyra remained in critical condition, drifting between consciousness and silence, but if he woke and spoke Nolan's name, everything would collapse. Nolan's final hope now rested on the ocean's secrecy and a man's fading grip on life. As the ship continued cutting across blue waters, heading toward its next port, the truth hovered just beneath the surface, like a shadow that refused to sink.